They were promised safety, warmth, salvation. 83 children sent beneath the halls of St. Adeline's Orphanage in 1891. The basement was locked from the outside for days. The sound of hymnals drifted through the floorboards. Then, silence. No bodies were ever recovered, only the faint echo of voices still praying. Where no chapel stands, the camera drifts across an empty stretch of winter fields. A gray sky, heavy with low clouds, presses against the earth. At the far end of the road, a stone building stands alone. Its steeple is small, its windows narrow, its doors dark and unwelcoming. This was St. Adeline's. It was not a school. It was not a home. It was a holding place for children no one wanted. The land had been given by a neighboring monastery, a gift, they said, to the county, a place where charity could live, where the abandoned might find a roof. But something was different about that soil. The monks, who had farmed the land for generations, had never built on it. Not a barn, not a shed, not even a cross to mark their prayers when asked why. Their answers were vague. The ground is restless, they said, not unholy, just unsettled. And still, the county built here, stone quarried from the same hills as the monastery's walls, wood brought in from the forests along the ridge. Every board, every nail, every pane of glass, set into a place the monks themselves refused to bless at first. It was quiet. The building rose in the span of 2 years. A central hall, lined with narrow dormitories, a kitchen, a dining room, a cellar meant only for dry storage, and beneath it, all a basement, wide, empty, and windowless. A space the builders themselves disliked entering. Workmen began to mutter about the air below. Cold, even in the summer. A smell, faint but sharp, like metal shavings and rain-soaked earth. Their tools echoed strangely against the stone. The sound dull and lingering. One man refused to continue after a day working beneath the chapel. He said he felt someone breathing behind him, though the space was empty. When the foreman laughed, the man packed his tools and left. His name was never added to the payroll ledger still. Construction finished, the county officials came. The parish priests arrived, prayers were read, though curiously, no formal blessing was ever recorded in the church logs. And then, in the months before the first child even set foot on its wooden floors, strange stories began to drift through the village. Fishermen claimed they saw faint candlelight glowing through the basement windows. Though none had yet been installed, farmers passing by swore they heard low murmurs at night, like the hum of distant singing carried on the wind. The few who entered at dusk to inspect the property described the same sound, though never from the same place. Sometimes beneath the floor, sometimes along the walls, sometimes behind the locked door to the basement stairs. No one could find the source. The county dismissed the tales as nerves. An empty building makes noises. They said old stone shifts, wood creaks, and the mind imagines. But for those who worked closest to the property, unease lingered even during the day. The shadows in the basement seemed too deep, as if the corners swallowed light. A lantern held high would dim, its glow fading as one approached the far wall. Some men swore the flame flickered in patterns, as if responding to something unseen. One caretaker, a man named Barlow, kept a private journal in his entries. He described hearing faint scratching beneath the foundation as he made his nightly rounds. Not rats, not insects. He wrote that the sound was steady, deliberate, like nails tracing the outline of the building from underneath. Barlow reported his findings to the parish overseer. The next day, his journal vanished from the records room. Barlow himself was reassigned to another parish 2 towns away. Explanation was given by the summer of 1891. St. Adeline stood ready, beds lined the dormitories. Staff had been hired, and still, the basement remained empty, unused. Locked villagers avoided walking past the property after sundown. They whispered that the building felt wrong, that it leaned ever so slightly, though no one could find a tilt in the walls or floors, that the air tasted different near its gates, stale, dry, like something sealed too long beneath the earth. And then, as the first cart of orphans made Its way up the long dirt path toward the front doors, the villagers gathered by the roadside to watch none step closer. None offered welcome. The children looked out from the wagon, thin, pale faces staring through the slats of the wooden frame, their expressions blank, resigned, and as they passed beneath the looming shadow of St. Adeline's, the wind shifted, the fields went still, the birds stopped calling, and from somewhere deep beneath the stone foundation, too soft for any ear, but Barlow's, who had returned that day only to deliver supplies, came a sound low, steady hum. It was not words, not a voice, just a single, continuous note. Barlow froze on the steps. The sound faded as quickly as it came, and when he told the staff later that night, they laughed, said it was his imagination, said the wind plays tricks out here. But Barlow wrote something in a new journal, one he kept hidden beneath his cot. Something beneath us already knows they're coming, and it's waiting. The first child would arrive in the morning. The road was long, wet with autumn rain, and lined with trees that had already shed their leaves. Their bare branches clawed against the gray sky as the wagons rolled through the mud. Each wagon carried children, thin, pale, and silent. 3 in total. They came from 3 counties. Foundlings, the sick, the unwanted, the ones whose names had been written only on parish rosters and county ledgers, never spoken at a dinner table. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the gates of St. Adeline's. The stone building loomed. Ahead, its windows like black sockets. Unlit and waiting, the staff stood in a line outside, collars pulled high against the chill. Some crossed themselves. Some avoided looking at the wagons. Altogether, the first wagon stopped. The children did not move. Their faces were drained of expression. Neither curious nor afraid, they looked past the staff, past the building, their eyes fixed on something none of the adults could see. But something wasn't right. The lead matron, Sister Hannelore, stepped forward. She clapped her hands, voice sharp against the still air, urging the children out. They obeyed, but slowly, as if each step cost them something. Their feet made little sound on the wet earth, the soft crunch of mud and gravel swallowed by the wind inside. The halls echoed with the noise of their arrival, boots scraping on wood, murmurs of names being checked against lists, the occasional cough or cry breaking the silence, and beneath it all, something quieter, the sound of the children humming, almost under their breath, in perfect unison. It was not a melody anyone recognized, not a hymn taught by the parish. It rose and fell in a strange, uneven rhythm, and when Sister Hannelore told them to stop, they did immediately, as if they had never made a sound at all. Their first night was spent in prayer. At least, that's what the ledgers say. The dormitory lamps burned late, their dim flames casting long shadows across the narrow beds. The children knelt beside their cots, heads bowed, hands clasped. The staff reported that they prayed for nearly an hour, without prompting, whispering softly to themselves. But the whispers didn't always sound like prayers. One attendant, a young woman named Colette, wrote in her diary that the murmurs seemed responsive, like half of the children were speaking, and the other half were answering. She said the cadence of their voices reminded her of a question, followed by a reply, and when she moved closer, she realized none of them were looking at each other. Their eyes were fixed on the walls, the cold, bare stone of the orphanage itself. She asked Sister Hannelore about it the next morning. The sister told her not to linger on such things. Asterisk, asterisk. These children have suffered, she said. They need comfort. They find it where they can. But Colette's entries grew more anxious with each night. She began hearing faint taps from within the walls as she made her rounds, always 3. Taps always just behind her as she passed. She told herself it was the settling of old stone, the cold contracting the mortar. But she started walking faster in the halls after dark, and that's when she heard it on the 4th night. As she checked the lamps, Colette paused outside the dormitory door. The children were meant to be asleep, yet inside, she heard that same uneven hum, low drawn out, like a hymn stripped of all melody. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the wood. Whisper broke through. Not to her, not to anyone, just a soft, fragmented word carried through the grain of the door, as though spoken from inside the wall itself. Her diary stops for that night. The next entry is brief, a single line written in haste. They are not praying to God. The next morning, Colette requested transfer to another parish. Her request was denied. She burned her diary in the kitchen stove and never spoke of it again. The children remained. 83 voices filling the corridors with murmurs that stopped whenever an adult entered the room. 83 pairs of eyes staring at the walls when no one was watching. And in the stillness after lights out, when the staff had retreated to their quarters, the sound would return, a faint, collective whisper, answering something only they could hear. It continued for weeks, until the first of the staff began to report hearing it, too, not just from the dormitories, not just from the halls, but from below, from the locked, empty basement. And though none dared enter that space, they all began to feel the same thing when walking above. A vibration in the floorboards, faint, rhythmic, like a heart slowly beating beneath the stone. It was then that Sister Hannelore began locking the basement door twice each night and sleeping with the key beneath her pillow. She would later tell the parish priest that she had no reason for this precaution, only a feeling. And by the time the first child fell ill, every member of staff would come to share it. None of them would call it fear, not yet, but none could deny that the sound beneath their feet was growing louder. The camera drifts downward, through the gray sky, past the empty courtyard, and into the stone foundations of St. Adeline's. The walls are wet with condensation. The air below is heavy, unmoving. This was where they sent them all, 83 children, down the narrow stairwell, through the wooden door, into a single, cavernous room beneath the chapel. The records say it began with a cough, a handful of fevers, 2 cases of vomiting. They, staff, fearing contagion, followed the instructions given by the parish physician. Isolate them. The basement had never been used for living quarters. It was cold, windowless, with a floor of packed dirt and uneven stone. There were no beds, only straw laid across the ground in rows. The walls sweated in the autumn chill. The single lantern hung from a beam, its light swallowed by the far corners. The nurses worked quickly. Blankets, water jugs, crates of bread and dried meat. A door was bolted from the outside. Once the children were inside, it was meant to be temporary, 3 days at most. But the lock held far longer at first. There were voices, murmurs, small songs, soft enough to drift upward through the wooden beams to the hall above. The nurses who stayed upstairs said it was almost comforting, the sound of children trying to calm themselves, praying for relief. But something wasn't right by the second night. The voices had changed. The melodies grew slow, measured, rhythmic, as if the children had found a leader among them, someone to guide the tone. And then a word none of the nurses could place, salve, repeated over and over, a Latin word. None of the children had been taught it. Few among the staff even understood it. A greeting, a welcome, but to whom? The singing grew louder as the nights passed, the same phrases, the same hypnotic cadence. Even when meals were lowered on ropes through the floor hatch, the voices did not stop. No one ate in silence. The hymns filled every moment, as though the sound itself was keeping something at bay or calling something closer. On the 5th night, the singing continued past dawn. Not one of the children had slept when the nurses called through the hatch. No one answered. The hymn did not falter. It simply changed tone, lower, heavier, as if the voices were sinking into the earth itself. The food crates were left untouched, the water unimpeded. That's when one of the attendants, a man named Elias, volunteered to check. He descended halfway down the stairs before stopping. Sound wasn't coming from the children anymore. It seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves, deep and resonant, as though the basement had learned the song. Elias backed away slowly. He told the others what he'd heard. None of them went down after that. For 3 more days, the singing continued without pause, day and night. It never rose above a murmur, but it never ceased. Not even when the children stopped responding to the staff by the 10th day. The nurses noted the silence of movement below. No coughing, No footsteps, only the hymn, still rising faintly from beneath the chapel floor. The parish physician, consulting the staff, made a decision. Seal the basement for now. The records do not say why no entry confirms the children's condition. No note mentions their removal, only a final line, added in the parish ledger. In handwriting different from the rest, the hymn continues, "Do not open the door." From that day forward, the basement was locked with 3 iron bolts. The food deliveries stopped. No one spoke of the children again, but every night, as the staff tried to sleep in their narrow cots above, they heard it faint, measured, endless, the voices still singing in a language they were never taught. And just before the final line of the hymn, a sound none could explain, a single note, low and steady, like the hum of a bell buried deep in the earth. It rang once. Then the hymn would begin again, and every nurse in St. Adeline's swore the same thing. It wasn't coming from the children anymore. It was coming from the ground beneath them. The night was still when he began his rounds. A thin mist clung to the edges of the fields, and the chapel stood quiet, its black windows reflecting nothing. Only the sound of his boots over the gravel broke the silence. His name was Samuel Kearney, a groundskeeper, hired by the parish to tend the land, repair the fences, and ensure the building stayed presentable for visiting clergy. He lived alone in a small cottage near the edge of the property. By all accounts, he was a man of few words, known mostly for his punctuality and his habit of humming to himself while he worked. But in the weeks following the quarantine, he stopped humming. It began one evening as he swept debris from the front steps of the chapel. The wind had carried dried leaves across the grounds, and the lantern he carried threw a long, unsteady shadow across the stones. That was when he heard a faint, deliberate scratch beneath the wooden planks of the chapel floor. He froze, crouched low, and pressed his hand to the boards. The sound came again, slow, measured like nails, tracing a circle beneath his feet. He told himself it must be rats. The foundation was old, vermin were common, and yet the rhythm of it felt intentional. A pause between strokes, a return to the same spot, as if something beneath the chapel was marking time. Kearney fetched a pry bar from his shed that night and returned after curfew. Once the sisters and attendants had gone to their quarters, the chapel was unlit, save for the single lantern he carried. Its flame trembled as he entered. Though no draft moved through the room, he followed the scratching to the center aisle, just before the altar. Then it stopped. The silence was heavier than the dark. He lowered himself to the ground, pressed his ear against the wooden boards, and waited for a moment. There was nothing, and then he heard it, not scratching, not movement, voices, small, childlike, speaking in unison, but not screaming, not even pleading. They were asking calmly, patiently, for him to join them. They called it a service, a word that made his chest tighten, though he could not explain why the voices were distant, but clear, threading through the boards, as if the wood itself had learned to speak. No names were spoken, no threats were made, only the repeated invitation, whispered in tones that rose and fell with a rhythm almost like breath. He pulled his head back, heart hammering, and stared at the altar. The lantern light flickered again. The boards beneath him were cool, but dry still. He felt a faint vibration in the wood, like the memory of a sound that refused to end. Kearney left the chapel without finishing his rounds. He told no one that night, but the next morning, he reported the incident to Father Brannock, the parish overseer. The priest dismissed it as nerves. The building was old, the foundation unstable. Voices carried strangely through the earth, especially when one was tired. Brannock told him to avoid the chapel at night. He said he would arrange for an inspection of the basement. The inspection never came. Kearney kept to his duties during the day, but each night he found himself glancing toward the chapel doors, watching the lanterns burn low behind its windows, waiting for the sound to return. It did 2 nights later. As he closed the main gate, the scratching began again, not beneath the floor this time, but from the far end of the property, where the chapel foundation met the earth. A steady, deliberate rhythm, traveling along the stone as if circling the building. He followed it, against his better judgment, until he stood at the rear wall of the chapel. The sound stopped. He leaned close, hand resting against the cold stone. Through the chill of the wall, he felt it, a faint, pulsing tremor like the beat of a heart, and then, softly, almost inaudible, the same voices from before, not pleading, not frantic, only asking again, with the same calm cadence. "Join us, the service begins." Kearney staggered back, nearly dropping his lantern. The flame flared, then dimmed though. Number Wind touched it. He fled to his cottage and barred the door. The following morning, he tried to speak again with Father Brannock. The priest cut him off before he could finish, warning him not to spread superstition among the staff. Brannock told him his duties were limited to the grounds, nothing more. He instructed Kearney to keep his observations to himself. 2 weeks later, Samuel Kearney was found dead. The cause was listed as sudden illness. No autopsy was performed. His body was buried in the monastery graveyard. Before the week ended, his personal effects tools, journal, even his lantern were collected and sealed in a locked chest by the parish. None were seen again, but among the staff, rumors spread quietly. They said Kearney's boots, still caked with soil, had been found on the chapel steps the morning he died. The dirt on the soles was damp and dark, as if he had been walking through the fields long after midnight. And in the nights that followed, the scratching beneath the chapel grew louder this time. The voices didn't call for anyone by name. They simply whispered a single phrase, over and full, over until dawn broke. The service has begun. No one would press their ear to the floor again, but every person who entered the chapel in those weeks swore the same thing. The boards beneath the altar felt different, hollow, as if something below was waiting to be filled. The hall of records was silent. Dust floated in pale shafts of light, cutting through the high, narrow windows. Rows of ledgers, bound in cracking leather, lined the wooden shelves. Most pages were neat, orderly dates, signatures, numbers, until the entries for St. Adeline's began. The handwriting changed each line, still careful but uneven. The ink pressed too hard into the page, as though the writer's hand shook while he worked. The dates marked late winter of 1891, just after the basement had been bolted shut. The first entry was from Father Albine, the parish scribe. He wrote of a sound coming from beneath the chapel, not the faint hymn they had all grown accustomed to, but something else, a sermon, words strung together in a language he did not understand, rising and falling in steady rhythm, though no voice carried them. He described it as echoing, resonant, as though the stone itself had learned to speak. But something wasn't right. Father Albin noted that the sound did not stop when he pressed his hands to his ears. It thrummed beneath the skin, a vibration that seemed to move through bone rather than air. He said the sensation left his teeth aching and his stomach unsettled for hours afterward. Other priests began to keep their own records. One described entering the chapel at dusk and smelling burning wax, not the faint residue of old candles, but the sharp, heavy scent of fresh smoke, thick enough to sting the eyes. Yet no candles had been lit in the building for days. The chapel was kept unlit to discourage visitors still. The smell clung to his robes for hours. He burned them that evening, and that's when he heard it alone. Kneeling at the far end of the chapel, he heard the sermon rise again from below. No recognizable words, no voice to follow, just a slow, rhythmic cadence, as if the walls themselves were reciting scripture from memory. When he tried to leave, the floorboards beneath the altar trembled faintly, as though something deep beneath had shifted. He left his account unfinished. Only the final line was written clearly. It listens. Every priest assigned to St. Adeline's wrote the same phrase in their ledgers. Each signature trembled. Some lines pressed so hard into the paper that they tore through to the page beneath. They recorded no more details after that. The final order was signed by 4 priests in the span of a single evening. Their handwriting, though varied, carried the same uneven weight. The order stated plainly: seal the basement, reinforce the altar, bar the doors. It is not to be opened again. No reason was given, no mention of the children, no note as to what became of them. Day after the order, The priests brought in masons. The men worked only in daylight. They filled the stairwell with stone and mortar, layer upon layer, until the entrance was gone. A new floor was set over the seal, covered in heavy boards and nailed tight. The masons refused to speak while they worked. Some carried rosaries in their pockets, clutched so tightly the wood left impressions in their palms. When the final board was nailed into place, the sound began again faint. At first, a distant hum, deep and resonant, rising through the stone like heat through iron. Every man in the room froze. The priests murmured prayers, voices overlapping, hands trembling as they clutched their collars. The masons packed their tools without speaking and left the property. Before dusk, none of them returned to collect their pay. The priests closed the ledger that evening. The final line was written by Father Albin himself, his ink smudged by what appears to have been a shaking hand. It listens, and now it knows our names. The following morning, the chapel doors were chained from the outside. Mass was relocated to the monastery proper. St. Adeline's was left dark, its windows shuttered, its halls empty, but for the echo of a sermon, no one could follow. And though the parish records stop there, one final note is scrawled in the margin of a later page, undated and unsigned. The smell of wax persists even with the windows open, even when the wind moves through the fields, as though candles still burn in a place where no flame is lit. No priest assigned to St. Adeline's ever entered the chapel. Alone again, but those who stood near the altar for even a moment swore the same thing. The boards still vibrated beneath their feet, not constantly, only when the sermon began to rise again, faint and formless. From somewhere far below, they stopped recording its intervals. They stopped trying to measure its patterns. Instead, every man signed the last page of the ledger the same way. No dates, no notes, only two words, written by hands that could not keep steady. It listens. The ink trails off on the final signature, the line cutting upward as if the pen was torn from the writer's grasp. No entry follows. The ledger was closed, sealed, and locked in the archive. But those who have handled it since claim they can still smell it, the faint, heavy scent of burning wax. And beneath it, so soft it seems imagined, a murmur, not words, not prayer, just the cadence of something waiting to be heard. Morning air was brittle when they arrived. 3 carriages, 6 men, all hand-picked by the parish. 2 priests, 4 laborers, accustomed to heavy work and unwilling to ask questions. The frost had not yet lifted from the fields. The chapel stood ahead, its windows boarded, its doors chained. The sound, faint but present, rose from beneath it. Not the hymn anymore, not the sermon, just a low, constant hum, like air moving through hollow stone. They had been told to retrieve the children. 3 weeks had passed since the lock-in. No one believed any would be alive. But the bishop insisted bodies must be recovered. Records must be complete. The priests carried holy water and rope. The laborers carried lanterns, chisels, and pry bars. Their boots struck the frozen ground in unison as they crossed the courtyard. The first chain was cut just after noon. The sound beneath the chapel ceased the moment the doors opened inside. The air was cold but dry. The boards beneath the altar felt firm, solid, as if they had never trembled at all. Still, the laborers refused to kneel or linger. Their lanterns flickered with no draft to stir them. Seal over the basement stairwell was crude, built in haste, stone, mortar, and wood layered unevenly, blocking the narrow descent. It took 3 hours to break through. Every strike of the chisel echoed far louder than it should have, as if the sound traveled down into a vast chamber. When the last brick fell, a stale, heavy air spilled upward. It had carried no rot, no sickness, only the faint metallic scent of something old and cold, like iron submerged in water. The priests ordered the lanterns lowered first. Their flames barely pierced the darkness. The men descended slowly, boots crunching on dirt that seemed to have dried unnaturally smooth. The basement was not large, but the walls faded into shadow, and that's when they saw it. No bodies, no sign of struggle, only 83 small sets of clothing, neatly folded, arranged in a perfect circle on the dirt floor. Every shirt, every pair of shoes, every woolen cap stacked. With deliberate care, at the circle's center, a single wooden crucifix lay flat. Its edges were burned black, though no ash or soot marked the ground around it. The men did not speak. One priest knelt to lift the crucifix. It was cold to the touch, far colder than the surrounding air. And then the first lantern went out. No wind, no hiss. The flame simply died, leaving one corner of the room swallowed in dark, the others back toward the stairs. But the priest remained kneeling, whispering scripture under his breath as he traced the blackened edge of the crucifix. Another lantern went out. The laborers dropped their tools and began climbing. Their boots struck the stairs fast, uneven, splintering the rotted wood as they went. The priests followed, their voices breaking as they tried to recite prayers louder than the growing hum beneath the floor. The hum rose as they climbed. It seemed to pulse through the boards and the stone, vibrating through the tools they carried, shaking the ink in. The priests' inkwells as they scrawled frantic notes on the first surface they could find. But something wasn't right. Every account ends the same way. Mid-sentence, the ink trails downward, lines jerking across the page as if the men's hands had been torn away. No record describes what happened once they reached the upper floor. No record names who made it out. Only a final, half-written line remains in Father Chale's journal. The circle. It was not meant for them. It was meant for... The pen tore through the paper there, snapping its tip. The rest of the page is blank. The rescue was never attempted again. The basement was resealed, this time with triple layers of stone and mortar. The circle of clothing and the crucifix were left undisturbed. Buried beneath, the priests swore oaths never to speak of what they saw. But in the years after, those who worked near St. Adeline's claimed that on cold mornings, when the ground was hard and the air still, they could hear it, a faint hum rising through the soil. Always the same note, never changing, and if one stood long enough above where the circle had been, they swore they could feel something beneath their feet. Not movement, not breathing, just a subtle, measured vibration, like something listening for its name. The parish closed. St. Adeline's permanently the following spring, but no one knows where. The priests who led the rescue were buried. Their records end as abruptly as their words, and those who claim to have found the abandoned journals say the ink carries a faint, chemical scent, not of decay, not of mold, but of wax, long extinguished, still warm to the touch. The records of St. Adeline's do not end. They are erased. The parish archives, once detailed to the day, carry no mention of the children. After October of 1891, no lists of names, no ledgers of food or medicine, not even a closing statement on the basement quarantine. The pages simply stop, replaced by new entries filed under routine maintenance and building costs. According to the diocese, St. Adeline's was shuttered due to structural damage or risk of fire. They said the old wood, they claimed, had grown brittle. The chapel was unsafe, unfit for worship, unfit for the sisters who lived there. But something wasn't right. Payroll ledgers, kept not by the parish, but by the regional accountants, show a final, unexplainable order. 83 wool blankets, purchased in late September, after the last known record of the children's arrival, all accounted for in the financial books. Not one accounted for in the orphanage itself. The blankets were never distributed. They were never returned. They were never burned. They simply vanished when questioned decades later. Church officials claimed the order was a clerical error, a duplication, an overstock item sent to another parish. But no other parish records show their arrival. The transaction ends at St. Adeline's 83. Blankets paid for, received, and unrecorded from that day forward. The names of the children fared worse. Adoption papers, baptismal records. Parish rolls scrubbed entire families who swore they had surrendered their sick and unwanted children to the sisters. Found their petitions struck through in diocesan archives. Some were told their children had been relocated to another home. Others were told their signatures never existed at all. Mothers wrote letters, dozens of them. Each received the same reply. Were no children housed at St. Adeline's during that time? Your recollection is mistaken. The handwriting on those letters was identical, each signed by a scribe whose own name does not appear in any diocesan employment roster. And that's when he heard Ida Clerk, years later, sorting through the storage vault beneath the chancery, claimed he heard faint humming while moving a crate marked St. Adeline's, retired records. The vault was sealed, no wind, no open windows, just a soft, low tone resonating. From inside the crate, growing louder as he touched it when he reported it, the crate was moved to a separate, locked chamber. Its contents were never catalogued. The humming stopped, but the clerk resigned 2 days later. He refused to speak of what he'd heard, except to say the sound had been familiar, the kind of tone a human throat could not sustain. But a room could. The diocese by then had prepared its final statement on St. Adeline's. The building would be condemned, its history reduced to a single paragraph in parish bulletins. Closed. Due to structural decay and the risk of fire, no residents were present at the time of closure. The grounds will remain blessed, but unused. But the building was never demolished. Only its windows shuttered, its doors barred. The chapel, basement, sealed beneath layers of brick and mortar, stood untouched for years. The land around it overgrew with tall grass and blackthorn. Though no fire ever struck its frame, inquiries continued for a time. A handful of mothers traveled to the diocesan seat, demanding answers. None were given. There, letters pleas for the return of their children's belongings were returned unopened. Some of those mothers, after weeks of petition, left small bundles of clothing and food at the gates of the chancery, not in protest, but as if they still believed someone might retrieve them. The blankets remained missing, every record pointing to their purchase, quietly sealed in vaults that no one outside the bishop's office was allowed to access. One archivist, decades later, admitted he had seen a notation on the ledger margin beside the blanket order, not in ink, but carved faintly into the paper, deep enough to leave impressions on the page below. The letters were uneven, shaking, written by a hand that seemed hurried, desperate, or unwilling to stay near the page for long. It read only. They were not for warmth. No one knows who carved it. No one knows when the page was removed from the ledger. Not long after, the archivist never saw it again. The official story remains unchanged. The diocese insists St. Adeline's held no residents, no children, no staff unaccounted for, but those who have touched the ledgers, those rare few who claim to have seen them before they were sealed, swear the pages are different, softer, as though the parchment itself has absorbed something it should not have. And when held close to the ear, they say, in the quietest hours of the night, the paper carries a faint, steady sound, not breath, just the faint rasp of cloth moving across dirt, as though something beneath the ground is still folding and unfolding blankets, over and over, waiting for someone to notice. Ruins of St. Adeline's had been left untouched for nearly 50 years. The wild grass had grown waist-high. The blackthorn and creeping ivy had swallowed the stones of the old foundation. Only the faint depression of the chapel's footprint remained, a shallow scar in the earth, darkened when it rained in 1973. A road extension project cut across the northern edge of the property. The construction crew, working by state contract, had been told the land was stable. No active foundation, no remnants beneath, just earth, long, packed, waiting to be graded. But something wasn't right. The soil was denser than expected. Every strike of the backhoe's bucket rang with an odd resonance, not like stone, not like wood, just a muted vibration, as if the ground itself held tension. One worker described it as a hum, not audible, but felt through the boots, through the handles of their shovels. A low, persistent thrum, vibrating up their arms each time metal struck dirt. The deeper they dug, the stranger it felt. The earth was uniform. No rock layers, no remnants of walls or beams, no evidence of the chapel's basement or the sinkhole that had swallowed it. Just packed, unbroken soil, and yet the hum never stopped. Some said it was machinery, a resonance from the nearby road equipment. But when the engines cut off for lunch, The vibration remained fainter now, but still there, and that's when he heard it. The foreman, standing by the trench, leaned down, pressing his palm flat to the cut earth. It wasn't just a vibration, it was rhythmic, slow, even, as though the soil beneath his hand pulsed with something living, a cadence too regular to be natural, too controlled to be chance. He pulled his hand back and ordered the crew to fill the trench for the day. No one argued, not openly, but as they left, each man swore the ground seemed to settle behind them, the hum fading with every shovelful of soil thrown back into place that night. None of them slept. Every worker on the crew reported the same dream. Not a vision, not a nightmare, just a voice. A child's voice, soft, close, whispering their names one by one as they lay in bed. Some said it came from the corner of the room. Others swore it was right against their ear, a warm breath brushing the edge of their jaw. But all agreed on one thing: the voice was calm, not threatening, not screaming. It was inviting, asking them to come back, to finish the work. One man, a veteran of 20 years in excavation, woke to find dirt on his pillow, fine, black soil, traced along the edge of his cheek. Though he had not stepped outside after leaving the site, another, sleeping in a motel 20 miles away, reported hearing the voice not only in his sleep, but while awake. A faint whisper from the bathroom vent, a single word, his name. By morning, 4 of the crew had quit the job entirely. The remaining 3 returned, refusing to step out of their trucks until state inspectors arrived to survey the site. The inspectors found nothing, no fault lines, no voids beneath the soil, no residual vibrations detectable with their instruments. The hum was gone. The trench, once filled, showed no sign of ever having been disturbed. But something wasn't right. When the foreman collected his logbook to turn over to the state, he found a line written across the last page. It was not his handwriting. The letters were faint, pressed deep into the paper, as though traced by a nail or a piece of wire. It read only, "Don't dig here, it already knows your names." The logbook was sent to the regional office, where it disappeared into storage. The road extension was rerouted, adding 2 unnecessary miles of pavement to avoid the site. No one questioned the cost. No one returned to St. Adeline's after the equipment was pulled. But those who worked the excavation swore the voice followed them long after. Some said they heard it in their homes, whispering their names from the dark corners of quiet rooms. Others claimed the sound came only in the rain, faintly from beneath the gutters, soft and steady, like a lullaby sung through the walls. None of them ever went back to that stretch of land. Even decades later, when the blackthorn thinned and the ground began to flatten again, none dared. They said the hum was still there, not through the soil, not through the shovels or boots, but through their own pulse. Every so often, late at night, lying in bed, they would feel it, that same slow, rhythmic cadence in time with their heartbeat, but not quite, just slightly out of sync, as though something else was keeping time alongside them, waiting for its turn to speak their names again. The field where St. Adeline's once stood is empty now. No walls, no markers, only a flat expanse of grass swaying under the constant wind that crosses the valley. The soil remains dark, darker than the surrounding farmland. It drinks the rain faster than it should. Each drop sinks and vanishes, leaving the surface cold to the touch. Even when the sun breaks through the clouds, it feels like standing on ground that was not meant to breathe. Paranormal researchers arrived in late autumn. They brought recorders, parabolic mics, and infrared arrays. Each instrument was set along the old footprint of the chapel, its boundaries traced from archived maps. For hours, they recorded nothing but wind and the distant creak of branches. The field gave nothing. No voices, no movement, no signs of disturbance beyond the low, constant rustle of the grass. And then, near dusk, it began. At first, it was faint, a low hum, barely above the threshold of hearing, slipping beneath the sound of the wind. Each listener described it differently. Some said it felt like a vibration through the soles of their boots. Others swore it was a tone, not sound but sensation, settling deep in the chest, like the first tremor of a distant quake, but something wasn't right. The hum was not random. It rose, fell, and held each shift too deliberate to be natural. The pattern formed notes. Then the notes began to thread together, soft and steady, weaving into something that could only be called a melody. The hymn no source could be found. The field was empty. The recorders picked it up, faint but clear, a layered harmony, as if many voices were singing in unison, low and slow. Each breath perfectly measured. The words were harder to hear. They came like whispers through cloth, muffled and distant, as if sung from beneath the earth itself. The researchers slowed the recording, amplifying the range. Some phrases matched known liturgical chants. Others did not. The final line, whispered beneath the melody, stood apart. No church text contained it. No hymn had ever ended with those words. We are not gone, only beneath. The researchers left the field by nightfall, not because the sound stopped it. Never did. Even as they packed their equipment, the hymn remained, threading through the wind like it had always been there. But one of them, a technician, swore he heard it differently as he crossed the property line. Not from below anymore, not muffled close, as if sung just behind his ear. He did not speak on the drive back. The others noticed his hands trembling, fingers clenching and unclenching against his knees when they reached town. He handed his recorder to the lead investigator and left without a word. He never returned to the project. The recording, scrubbed and cleaned, remains archived. The final words are unmistakable, even slowed to half speed, even filtered through layers of static. The voice is clear, almost childlike. We are not gone, only beneath. The field was fenced off soon after, not by the state, but by the church. A private deed was filed quietly, listing no purpose, no plans for construction. No sign marks its boundary, but those who drive by see the tall metal posts and wire stretching around the site. The gate is locked, the chain heavy and rusted, the padlock replaced every few years. No one visits after dusk, not locals, not trespassers. Those who have tried say the wind along the fence line feels wrong. Still, even when it blows strong elsewhere, like a space holding its breath, a few, those brave enough to linger, claim they have heard it, the hymn, faint and patient, threading through the grass like a lullaby sung through soil. It does not stop for them, it does not change, but each time they swear the final words sound louder, as if something below the field is learning to be heard. The church still holds the deed. The field remains untouched. The grass kept short by nothing but wind and time. And on certain nights, when the clouds settle low and the air turns heavy, the hymn begins again. Always the same, always ending with that final soft promise, drifting upward from the earth as though spoken directly beneath your feet. We are not gone, only beneath. No one knows what will happen when the voices grow strong enough to rise above the soil, but those who have stood near the fence on nights when the hymn plays swear they feel like a faint, measured tremor beneath their boots, in time with the voices, in time with something waiting below, and each time the words return, they sound less like a whisper and more like a warning. St. Adeline's was meant to save the forgotten, yet on consecrated soil they were erased, not by plague, nor fire, nor famine. Some truths are buried too deep for the living, and too loud for the dead, and if you listen on cold autumn nights, you may hear their hymn rise again beneath the ground.